Good evening. I'm Professor Gavin Giovannoni from Barts and the London. Apologies that I can't be with you tonight in Cairo. I had other clinical commitments that did not allow me to travel. I'm sure if I was there, I would know a lot of you. I love your country, and I'm particularly fond of Cairo. It's probably one of the most alive cities I've visited in the world. Anyway, I've been tasked with updating you on the ORATORIO primary progressive results and putting it into clinical context. I'm going to just quickly share my screen. I'm using Google Hangouts, and you should now see my screen with my presentation. So my task is to go through the efficacy of Ocrelizumab on the clinical and subclinical manifestations of multiple sclerosis. Before doing this, I'd just like to point out my disclosures and that I am being compensated for giving you this webinar tonight. And I have been an active steering committee member on the Ocrelizumab development program, including the ORATORIO or primary progressive trial. I think B cells now are center stage in terms of how we think about the pathogenesis of multiple sclerosis. And I go back to this pathology paper from 10 years ago, just showing you that in almost all MS lesions, be they active, inactive, slowly expanding, or the meningeal pathology, have B cells. Therefore, they make a very good hypothetical therapeutic target. And the Ocrelizumab results support and prove that hypothesis that the B cell plays a central role in the pathogenesis of multiple sclerosis. So the ORATORIO was a pretty unique study up until now, in that we probably took on board the lessons learned from other previous trials when designing this. So our population was specifically selected based on the post hoc analysis of the rituximab in primary progressive disease, showing an impact of rituximab in a particular group of people with primary progressive disease. These tended to be people that were much younger, early on in the onset of the disease, with more inflammatory activity. And so you can see that our age restriction was up to 55. The EDSS range was 3 to 6.5. We made sure all people had an abnormal CSF. Okay, and we tried to target a much younger group. In the primary progressive trial, we actually gave Ocrelizumab as paired infusion throughout the study. The rationale for that was we thought we needed better CNS penetration of the antibody, but that didn't prove to be necessary. So when the drug is now licensed, it's licensed with 2 doses up front. Those are 300 milligram doses with 600 milligrams 6 monthly thereafter. This just shows you the baseline characteristics. You can see the median age is 46, younger than other primary progressive trials. As expected, half of them were women. Time since first symptoms 6, with a diagnosis of under 2 years, 1.6 years. EDSS score 4.5, which shows you that the majority of these people were below 6. And I think that's an important thing. They were at a stage of their disability progression or the disability worsening where there was a lot of reserve capacity, and that's one of the reasons why we were able to show a treatment effect in 120 weeks. Most patients were treatment naive, and different to other trials is that almost 30% of these people had gout enhancing lesions on baseline. So it's more inflammatory population. So when we actually have our treatment targets, we focus on what we can do clinically. And in a primary progressive population, the obvious thing is to prevent disability worsening. And so our primary outcome was confirmed disability progression. And then we also went for some subclinical markers on MRI. This is the primary outcome. So there was a 24% reduction in 3-month confirmed disability progression relative to placebo. And the first question you're going to say, well, was this driven by the population with gout-enhancing lesions at baseline? No, it wasn't. You can see that in both the groups with gout-enhancing lesions at baseline and those with, let's just go back to the 3-month, and those without gout-enhancing lesions, there was a significant result or trend. But you've got to realize this was a post-hoc analysis, and the subgroups here are underpowered to give us an answer. So it's important to realize that these figures are an estimate. And in my opinion, ocrelizumab is working in those with and without gad-enhancing lesions at baseline. Moving to the more robust 24-week confirmed disability progression, again, we can see there was a 25% reduction relative to placebo, and there was a strong trend in both those with and without gad-enhancing lesions. You can see the hazard ratios of 0.4 and 0.6, 0.59. What does this mean? So if you took 10 people with primary progressive disease, it means that nearly 7 out of 10 of these patients would be free of confirmed disability progression over 120 weeks. And this may be a good graphic to try and use to illustrate to your patients the impact of ocrelizumab. Now, when we look at patients that were free of relapses, you say, well, this was a primary progressive population, there shouldn't be any relapses, which is incorrect. We know that if we took a population of primary progressive patients and followed them up for a period of time, about a quarter will go on to have relapses during their lifetime. And so in this study, in the placebo arm, you can see about 16% of people had relapses, whereas in ocrelizumab arm, it was only about 7%, 6 to 7%. But just looking at those people that were free of relapses, okay, you can see that there was a 26% reduction in 12-week confirmed disability progression. So this was not driven by relapses in the total population. Now, during the study, we had the opportunity of extending the follow-up beyond 120 weeks because not all patients were unblinded at the end of the trial because this was an event-driven study. We kept people blinded until we had enough events. And so you can actually extend the analysis further out, and we've done that. And you can see, looking at the 12 and 24th week, there was a 25 and even a further 30% reduction. And the ocrelizumab primary progressive trial has been criticized in the past simply because some people were saying that the Kaplan-Meier didn't behave the way it should behave. But when you look at the 24-week confirmed disability progression, you can see the curves are opening up, which means more events are happening and the survival curve is going apart. Now, you can see that even though we had what we would call a pure primary progressive population, there was that subset that went on to have relapses, and there is little doubt that ocrelizumab, even in the primary progressive trial, reduced patients, proportion of patients who had relapses. Now, something that is very close to my heart, this is now looking at some of the secondary and tertiary outcome measures, is that ocrelizumab not only delayed worsening on EDSS, but also on the 25-foot time walk by 27%. And very importantly, it slowed down worsening of upper limb, loss of upper limb function by 45% relative to placebo. And the reason why I think there's this discrepancy with a bigger treatment effect in upper versus lower limbs is based on a hypothesis we've put forward called the length-dependent axonopathy hypothesis. In other words, the fiber tracts that are longer are more likely to be hit multiple times and are much more likely to degenerate early and have less reserve capacity. And here, as an example, is a pyramidal system, lower limb longer versus upper limb shorter. Therefore, the upper limb have a pathway with more reserve. Therefore, you're much more likely to see a treatment effect in upper limb in 120 weeks versus lower limb. And it explains why there's a larger treatment effect in the upper versus lower limb. Because hidden in those curves going apart is not necessarily only worsening, but also improvement. And so we think that the pathway with more reserve has an ability to improve in function relative to the pathway with less reserve to the lower limbs. I would urge you to read our paper, which came out 2 years ago now, on the length-dependent axonopathy hypothesis that explains this in more detail. Now, what about using a composite disability progression? And we're now getting used to composites because our treatment target now in terms of managing MS is to target different components that we can measure. And so, yeah, we have the composite of progression, which not only includes the EDSS, but the time 25-foot walk and the 9-hole peg test. And you can see there was a 26% reduction of ocrelizumab versus placebo using the composite with a hazard ratio of 0.74. Now, I'm a big proponent of hand function in multiple sclerosis. The campaign we've been running is called Think Hand, and this particular socio-economic study done by Gisela Cobalt across Europe shows that very, very well. You can see as people become more disabled, their utility, which is a quality of life score measured with the EQ5D, drops off. And there's a particular drop-off when people go into a wheelchair, in other words, lose mobility, but there's a massive drop-off when they lose upper limb function. And people that are quadriparetic are actually judged to have a quality of life worse than death, and a utility that's below 0. As far as I know, MS is the only disease where you score a utility of less than 0. On the right here, you can see the cost of treating people annually. As you can see, as your disability goes up, the cost of treating somebody with MS goes up. And there's, again, 2 inflection points, one when you become wheelchair bound and one when you lose upper limb function. It's not surprising for people with multiple sclerosis, their arms are their legs when they're in a wheelchair. So the costs of looking after somebody who loses upper limb function are extortionate. So this is a rationale for us doing trials to try and protect upper limb function in people with primary progressive disease, which we're trying to do. So we explored our ORATORIO data set to see if we had any hint of preventing these later disability progressions. And yeah, you can see that the risk of not reaching 7 and not needing a wheelchair was reduced by 42%. Okay, and the intention to treat population yeah, and this is the 3-month, and when you look at 6-month EDSS progression confirmed at 6 months, it was 41%. So ocrelizumab does reduce your chances of needing a wheelchair by over 40%. What about those that were less disabled? So we're excluding the 6.5, and yeah, we see the treatment effect is 69 and 75% for the 12-week and 24-week progression. And so I think the reason why we're getting a jump up in efficacy from 40 to 70 and 70+% is because there's more reserve capacity. In other words, the more reserve there is, the more likely you are to recover function, and it brings your disability progression backwards. So this is very compelling data that ocrelizumab has a major impact in slowing disability milestones. So inclusion then, I hope I've added to your knowledge, and I think ocrelizumab, or the ORATORIO trial, shows that B cells play a pivotal role in the pathophysiology of primary progressive disease. It's the only treatment to date that shows a consistent and statistically significant clinical effect in the primary progressive population. It was positive on the 12-week, which is the primary endpoint, and more importantly on the more robust 24-week confirmed disability progression endpoint. And it met multiple key secondary endpoints. So this was not driven by the a fluke result on the primary outcome. It was seen across multiple secondary outcomes. And I think the safety profile, which you've seen in the other presentations, was favorable. I want to highlight there was a greater impact on upper limb hand function, and this provides us with a rationale for testing ocrelizumab in more advanced patients with primary progressive disease. And this is testing our length-dependent axonopathy hypothesis, and that's why we are launching an international multi-center study looking at the impact of ocrelizumab in preservation of upper limb function. So the primary outcome is going to be 9-hole peg test, and we extend in EDSS range up to 8 And so this is a very bold trial that Roche is sponsoring, and we look forward to the initiation of this trial, and hopefully it'll recruit very quickly, and we'll be able to come back to you in about 5 years' time with a result that even if you're in a wheelchair, Ocrelizumab has an impact in slowing down disease progression in the upper limbs. Thank you very much. I will be back slightly later to answer some questions.